The hospital in Magnolia Bend smelled like antiseptic and rain, even on days when the sky outside was clear. Nurse Odette Fontaine had worked the neonatal ward for 11 years, long enough to know which cries meant hunger and which meant something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed with a bottle or a blanket. The boy in the corner incubator, the one the staff had started calling Bear, because of the stuffed animal someone had left clipped to the side of his bassinet, cried with that second kind of cry. He had come into the world 6 weeks early, weighing barely 4 pounds, during the worst storm season the parish had seen in a decade. His mother had vanished from the hospital before the paperwork was even finished, leaving behind nothing but a signature that didn't match any name in the system. No father came forward. No grandmother, no aunt, no family friend with a spare room and a willing heart. For the first 4 months of his life, Bear's only visitors were the nurses who rotated through 12-hour shifts, women who loved him in the way you love something you know you cannot keep. "He needs a name," Odette said one evening to her supervisor, a tired woman named Greta who had seen 100 children pass through these doors and out into the foster system like water through a sieve. "He can't go through the world being called Bear forever. The state will give him one eventually," Greta said, "if nobody claims him." But nobody did. And so the boy who would later be called Theo by people who had never expected to love him spent the early months of his life learning the rhythms of machines instead of lullabies, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum instead of footsteps coming to pick him up. He learned to startle less at the sound of monitors beeping. He learned, in whatever way an infant learns anything, that comfort came in shifts, that the warmth of one set of arms would always, eventually, be replaced by another. 300 miles away, in a brick row house with ivy creeping up one side, a woman named Margaret Calloway sat at her kitchen table staring at a stack of adoption agency brochures she had read so many times the corners had gone soft. Margaret was 43, a high school chemistry teacher who had spent the better part of 2 decades believing that children were simply not going to be part of her story. She had made peace with that belief the way you make peace with a chronic ache, not by curing it, but by learning to live around its edges. Her husband, Daniel, had died 4 years earlier, suddenly, on an ordinary Tuesday, of a heart defect no one had known he carried. There had been no warning, no last conversation that mattered more than the others, just an ordinary morning that became the last one. In the years since, Margaret had rebuilt her life carefully, like someone repairing a stone wall one rock at a time, fitting each piece into place without quite expecting the wall to hold weight again. It was her sister, Beatrice, who had first mentioned fostering. "You don't have to adopt," Beatrice said over coffee one Sunday. "You don't have to do anything permanent. But you have so much love in you, Margie, and it's just sitting there with nowhere to go." Margaret had laughed it off at first. She was too old, she said. Too set in her routines, too used to silence. But the thought lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs and refused to leave, the way certain ideas do when they're actually meant for you. She filled out the first form on a whim, mostly to prove to herself that she wouldn't go through with it. 6 months later, she was sitting in a windowless office across from a caseworker named Renata, looking at a photograph of a boy with enormous brown eyes and ears that seemed slightly too big for his head, a boy who had been in the system for the better part of a year and who had, according to the file, difficulty bonding due to early medical trauma. "He's had 3 placements already," Renata said carefully, "the way people speak when they're trying not to discourage you and not to lie to you at the same time. He's a good boy. He's just guarded. It takes him a long time to trust." Margaret looked at the photograph for a long moment. There was something in the boy's expression that she recognized immediately, though she couldn't have said why, a kind of careful blankness, the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned that hope is dangerous. She had worn that same expression herself, she realized, in the weeks after Daniel died, when well-meaning people would ask how she was doing and she would have to decide, each time, whether honesty was worth the trouble. "Tell me about him," she said. "Everything. I want to know everything before I meet him." The first meeting happened on a Thursday in March, in a playroom with scuffed walls and a carpet that smelled faintly of disinfectant no matter how many times it was cleaned. Theo was 3.5 by then, small for his age, with a wariness in his posture that made him seem older than his years and younger at the same time. He sat in the corner with a set of plastic dinosaurs, lining them up by size rather than playing with them in any conventional sense, and he did not look up when Margaret entered the room. "Hi, Theo," she said, lowering herself to the floor a respectful distance away. "I'm Margaret." He glanced at her once, assessing, the way a small animal assesses a larger one before deciding whether to run. Then he went back to his dinosaurs. She did not push. She had read enough by then to know that pushing was the wrong instinct, that a boy who had been picked up and put down by strangers his whole life needed to see, over and over, that she was not going to disappear the moment he let his guard down. So she sat. She picked up a dinosaur of her own, a small green one with a broken tail, and she began to build a careful little world on the carpet beside his, not in his, careful never to cross the invisible boundary he had drawn around himself. "What's his name?" she asked, nodding at the dinosaur in his hand. Theo considered this question with surprising gravity. "He doesn't have one," he said. "He's still deciding." "That's smart," Margaret said. "Names are important. You shouldn't rush them." Something in his face shifted, just slightly, a loosening around the eyes that she would later come to recognize as the closest thing Theo had, in those early days, to a smile. He did not speak to her again that visit, but when she stood to leave, he held up the green dinosaur with the broken tail and said, very quietly, "You can have him. For next time." She kept that dinosaur for years. It sat on her dresser long after Theo had outgrown plastic toys altogether, a small green sentinel marking the exact moment when something in both of them had quietly decided to try. The process of becoming Theo's mother was not the swift, cinematic transformation that adoption stories are sometimes made to seem in the retelling. It took 14 months of supervised visits, home studies, court dates that were postponed and rescheduled, and long nights where Margaret lay awake wondering if she was doing the right thing, if she had any business raising a child who had already been failed by so many adults, if love alone, assuming she even had the right to call what she felt love yet, would be enough. There were setbacks. Theo had nightmares that left him screaming in a way that terrified Margaret the first dozen times it happened, convinced she had done something wrong, before a therapist explained gently that this was simply how trauma sometimes surfaced in small bodies that had no other language for what they'd survived. There were tantrums that seemed to come from nowhere, triggered by things as small as a change in dinner plans or an unfamiliar babysitter. There was a period of about 6 weeks when Theo refused to call her anything at all, not Margaret, not the tentative mom he had begun experimenting with, nothing, as if naming her might make the inevitable loss of her hurt more when it came. But there were other moments too, moments that arrived quietly and stayed. The first time Theo fell asleep against her shoulder during a car ride and didn't wake up startled when she carried him inside. The afternoon he drew a picture of their house with 3 stick figures in front of it. Himself, Margaret, and a dog they didn't yet own but that he insisted, with the unshakable confidence of a 4-year-old, they would one day get. The evening, nearly a year into their life together, when he climbed into her lap during a thunderstorm, pressed his face into her collarbone, and said, so softly she almost missed it, "You're not going to leave, right? Even when I'm bad." "Even when you're bad," she told him, and meant it with a certainty that surprised her, a certainty that had nothing to do with paperwork or court dates and everything to do with the fact that somewhere in those 14 months, without her quite noticing the transition, he had simply become her son. The adoption was finalized on a gray Tuesday in November, in a courtroom that looked nothing like the dramatic, sun-drenched rooms Margaret had imagined from television. A judge with tired eyes and a kind voice signed a stack of papers, said a few formal words about the joining of a family, and then, almost as an afterthought, smiled at Theo and asked if he had anything he wanted to say. Theo, who was nearly 5 by then and had developed an opinion about almost everything, thought about this for a long moment. "Can I have a dog now?" he asked. The courtroom laughed, and Margaret laughed too, through tears she hadn't quite managed to blink back, and somewhere in that laughter the long, uncertain road that had brought them to this room finally, quietly, closed behind them. They got the dog, a scruffy, good-natured mutt from the county shelter that Theo named Biscuit after careful, lengthy deliberation, and life in the brick row house settled into a rhythm that neither of them could have predicted 4 years earlier. Margaret kept teaching chemistry, adjusting her schedule around school pickups and pediatrician appointments, and the particular chaos of raising a child who, it turned out, had an enormous amount of energy once he felt safe enough to spend it. Theo grew. Not just in the ordinary, expected way that children grow, though there was plenty of that too. He shot up 3 inches the summer he turned 8, outgrowing 2 pairs of shoes in a single season, much to Margaret's bemused frustration, but in the deeper way, the way that mattered more. The wariness that had once defined every interaction with a new adult slowly gave way to a kind of cautious openness. Then, eventually, to the easy confidence of a boy who had finally internalized the lesson that the people in his life were not, in fact, going to disappear. He struggled in school those first couple of years, behind in reading, prone to outbursts when frustrated, And Margaret spent countless evenings at the kitchen table working through phonics flashcards with the same patience she'd once reserved for explaining covalent bonds to disinterested teenagers. By the time Theo was 10, he had not only caught up but developed a fierce, surprising love of books about space. Astronauts, black holes, the improbable physics of how anything managed to exist at all. Margaret often found him sprawled on the living room floor with library books stacked 3 deep, asking questions she couldn't always answer, which delighted him more than if she'd had every answer ready. "You don't know everything," he told her once, grinning, when she admitted she wasn't sure how neutron stars worked. "No one does, baby," she said. "That's the whole point of being curious." There were hard years too, as there are in any family, blood or chosen. The middle school years brought a sullenness that worried Margaret more than she let on, a closing off that reminded her, in unsettling flashes, of the boy lining up dinosaurs by size in a playroom years before. She learned, during that stretch, to give him room without giving up, to knock before entering his bedroom but to keep knocking, to let silences sit without filling them with anxious questions, trusting that he would come back to her in his own time, the way he always eventually did. He came back to her fully on an unremarkable Sunday afternoon when he was 13, slouched at the kitchen counter while she made dinner, when he said, apparently out of nowhere, "Do you ever think about her?" The woman who, you know." Margaret set down the knife she'd been using and gave the question the weight it deserved. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I think about her on your birthday, mostly. I hope, wherever she is, that she's okay. And I hope she knows you turned out wonderful, even though she's not the one who gets to take credit for it." Theo considered this with the same careful gravity he'd once given to naming a plastic dinosaur. "I don't think I'm mad at her," he said finally. "I used to think I was supposed to be. But I'm not. I think she just couldn't. And you could. That's not the same as her not loving me. I think maybe it's just different kinds of can't and can." Margaret had to turn back to the cutting board for a moment, blinking hard, because there were times Theo said things with such unexpected wisdom that it nearly undid her, and she didn't trust her voice not to crack. "That's a very generous way to see it," she managed. "I learned generous from somebody," Theo said, and went back to his homework, leaving her standing at the counter with a half-chopped onion and a heart too full to properly explain. By the time Theo turned 16, he had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered young man with an easy laugh and a habit of leaving his shoes in the middle of the hallway that drove Margaret to mild, affectionate despair. He had taken up running, somewhat to his own surprise, after a gym teacher noticed he had a natural endurance that translated into a genuine talent for cross-country. He spent weekend mornings on long runs through Magnolia Bend's wooded trails, returning sweaty and grinning, full of stories about deer he'd startled or the exact moment a particular hill had nearly defeated him. He had also, in the way teenagers do, become someone Margaret sometimes had to actively work to keep up with. Quicker than her with technology, fluent in cultural references she only half understood, prone to opinions about music and politics and the world's general unfairness that he delivered with the passionate, slightly exhausting certainty of someone discovering, for the first time, how much there was to have opinions about. She loved this version of him too, loved watching him become a person distinct from the boy she had raised, even when that becoming meant he no longer needed her in quite the same way. There was an evening, not long after his 16th birthday, when he found her in the kitchen going through an old box of photographs. Pictures from the early years, Theo at 3 with his dinosaurs, Theo at 5 in his too big graduation gown from kindergarten, Theo at 8 grinning around a missing front tooth. He sat down across from her without being asked and looked through them with her in companionable silence, occasionally laughing at some particularly unfortunate haircut or outfit. "I don't really remember most of this," he admitted, holding up a photo of himself as a toddler asleep on Margaret's shoulder. "Like, I know it happened because there's a picture, but I don't actually remember it." "That's normal," Margaret said. "Most people don't remember much before they're 4 or 5. "But you remember it," he said. "All of it. Even the parts before I do." "I remember all of it," she agreed. Theo was quiet for a moment, turning the photograph over in his hands. "Thanks for remembering for both of us, then," he said finally, and the simplicity of it, the unguarded warmth in a boy who had once refused to call her anything at all, struck Margaret with a force she hadn't expected on an ordinary Tuesday evening over a box of old photographs. "It's the easiest thing I've ever done," she told him, and she meant every word of it. People sometimes asked Margaret, especially in those early years, whether she ever regretted the decision. The long process, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty of taking on a child whose early trauma nobody could fully predict the shape of. She found the question strange, almost unanswerable, the way it might be strange to ask someone if they regretted breathing. What she understood, watching Theo grow from a wary 3-year-old lining up dinosaurs into a 16-year-old who ran through autumn woods and asked unanswerable questions about black holes and remembered, now, finally, to thank the people who loved him. What she understood was that love was never really about blood, and it had never really been about rescue either, the way people sometimes wanted to frame it. As though she had done something heroic by simply choosing to show up, again and again, for a boy who needed someone to. It had been, more than anything, an act of mutual patience. Theo had taught her things too, after all. Taught her that trust could be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick, the way she had once rebuilt her own life after Daniel died. He had taught her that you could love someone fiercely and still respect the boundaries trauma had carved into them. He had taught her that families were not things you were given but things you built, deliberately, with the kind of attention most people reserved for their most important work. On the night before his junior year began, Theo came downstairs in his running clothes, restless with the particular energy of someone about to start something new.